In this podcast, Kassem takes us through his opinion on whether the lats has an effect or an indirect effect on the scapula when doing the depression movement. He has also mentioned a lot of studies and also sent them to us. I put them right after this clip so you can see them before watching the entire podcast. Hope you like it and hope you will like and subscribe if you want more content like this in the future. And again, we just want to say a huge thank you to you, Kassem, for taking or giving us this opportunity. And also, if you guys want to know more about lat stuff and so on, then go follow Kassem on Instagram. Do you have a deadline or something you have to do? How long do you have?
I put 90 minutes in. If we go a little over, that's fine.
Okay, that's perfect. I have clients in 90 minutes as well, so that'll probably work out. Okay. Yeah, well, Kassem Hanson, thank you very much for taking the time to meet us here. So the main focus we have for this podcast is kind of also to get to know you in one, where you come from, maybe a little bit of your background for mostly our Danish followers. If anyone does not know, I was with you at the practicals in 2022 in Boulder, Colorado, and I've spoken quite highly of it, but I want to hear what has changed since that and what you maybe have evolved or maybe a different takes on some of the stuff we used to, that we did spend a lot of time on. And but yeah, but the main focus is the lat debate. So we made a video regarding the function of the lats at the scapula or the sternoclavicular joint or the scapular joint, whatever you want to call it. And then Jack Ribber, who is also one of our ambassadors, made a video claiming that, well, we'll go through the points, but that's really just how it started. I think you did a podcast with Elle as well,
Yes.
Scientific Niche, a few months ago, maybe 6 months back. Um, I think when I watched that podcast, I think it'll be good to you've made an outline to go through it like a bit more, yeah, from top to bottom and go through all the points and more in depth. So we'll get as much nuance and context as possible. Yeah, but Cass, so can you introduce yourself just for like 30 seconds or something?
Yeah. So I'm Coach Kassem online, and I've been coaching and educating for way too long, right? But over half my life at this point in time, so over 20 years. Um, and basically, my approach and the methods that I've come up with, I have a brand called N1, which is focused on looking at the individual, everything from their structure, to how they move, etc., and then using that to try and match them up with the best exercises, and technique. If you follow me on social media, you're probably very much familiar with biomechanics, but we actually do a ton more on program design. It's just that what I feel is that in order to write good programs, you have to understand biomechanics. Like you have to know what the reps are before you start making decisions on, how many reps you're going to do, how many sets, etc. So that's what everybody sees is they see the entry point for us, which is, biomechanics, which is what we think is very important for coaches to know on top of the foundational stuff before they start worrying about super advanced programming questions.
Okay, cool.
Are you still coaching yourself or are you just educating other trainers?
So I would say what I do now, I haven't done any like legit coaching in quite some time. Now what I do more so is I do like limited mentorship. So because with my schedule and the things that I want to focus on, I can't be a good coach in terms of, being able to reply to clients on a timely manner and be on their schedule. But what I can do is I work mostly with coaches or athletes that basically want to work on a consulting basis where I help them through the trouble solving process, and then they can usually apply that stuff in between. So it allows me to work with people that are just trying to like, get their thought process up to a next level or trying to solve very difficult problems. But it alleviates me from the burdens of the coach's schedule.
Mm. Okay, cool. And I'm very curious to hear what's been going on like the last few years. So I remember at our practical, it was about the time where, the CAS bullshit was going on with Dr. Mike. And we spend also a lot of time trying to go through every division of the muscles in the body to go through the most lengthened position, most shortened position. Not that you needed to go there, but just provide the information so we as coaches could take maybe a bit more professional and have more in mind when programming or setting people up. Um, what has evolved at the practicals or since like the last few 4 or 5 years, it must be 4 years?
Well, the one thing that always evolves is we just refine things and get better at teaching things, right? So the more feedback we get from students, the more we get to see where people still have problems or whatnot. We kind of, change things around a little bit or improve the way that we communicate. And of course, we keep doing research on trying to refine positions and stuff. One thing that's probably started being really popular right around that time was the stuff on range of motion. So lengthened partials, full stretch, stuff like that. And so now probably, a larger portion is dedicated to helping people understand that topic, but also like reeling people back in, so they don't get so consumed by the hype that they think that, okay, the only exercises worth training are the super stretch and stuff. So we spend time educating people more on how to make use of the full range of motion, and where things like lengthened partials and stuff are more practical and applicable and things like that. So that's probably one of the biggest additions. But outside of that, I mean, it's just been refining. I think, you know, right around the time you came, I don't know for sure if it was there, we started teaching a little bit more of the trunk positions for the pecs and lats as well, which is a greater level of nuance that probably not everybody needs. But, since range of motion was becoming significantly more popular and, maybe there's a potential benefit of getting even further into a stretch, we decided to, like, I decided to be like, okay, let's look at how we could, extend this, extend the lats even further than just using the shoulder joint and, the sternoclavicular joint, but actually using, lateral bending and rotation as well. And so we started including those components. And actually, I think what we did is I probably gave too many details on that initially, and then we backed it off a little. We try to find like that place where it's like, okay, we're not overcomplicating the technique too much, but here's how you can use these tools in a simple way. And that's often the way it goes, is like when you're covering nuanced stuff. The first couple times you teach it, you probably teach it over technically. And then what ends up happening is you have to figure out how to better simplify that so that people can just take what they need. Because obviously, you don't need to teach your clients about every fiber in the lat and how it's all moving and changing, whatever. You just need to be able to understand how to adjust an exercise to get a goal or experience for that client, right?
Okay. Before we go into the lab stuff, then you said something about you do in-house research. I would love to know what kind of measuring tools do you use? What do you have available? Yeah, how do you do this research?
So we have an EMG system, an Neuraxon system that allows us to do EMG. We have a 9 sensor system. So basically it allows us to test a lot of muscles simultaneously. And so we look at EMG a little bit differently than most places where they're just looking at magnitude. We tend to focus on the ratio between muscles and just basically, I don't look at any published research where they only measure like one muscle and look at it going up and down is extremely informative. It's not completely useless, but EMG already being a limited proxy, that's an even more limited context. So what we try and do is we try and look at the ratio of things in certain contexts so that we can see certain regions or certain synergists going up or down when we make a certain change into the technique of the setup. We also use a technology called NIRS, which is near infrared spectroscopy. Say that like 20 times fast. But essentially what it is it's a way of using wavelengths that are shooting into the tissue and bouncing back to measure how much hemoglobin is present and how much of that is oxygenated. So we can see how the blood flow gets constricted by the muscular tension, and then we can also see how the oxygen gets depleted by the actual process of, creating the ATP within the muscle. So it provides us another way of kind of looking at, okay, how hard is this muscle working? How much tension is there? How constant is that tension, right? And to maybe what a better degree of like what proximity to failure that muscle's going to versus other things. Because let's say you're doing a row and I'm doing EMG, just because something has a high signal, that doesn't tell me really that that muscle went to failure. Or sometimes, like depending on how we look at EMG, we can look at an average, and something might have like a peak and a valley and a peak and a valley, and another thing might be like slow up, slow down. And those are two very different kind of ways that the muscles are creating tension, but their averages could be the same. So we have to look at like the waveform data, but then we also have this NIRS data on top that gives us like more insight into how that tension is being experienced by the muscle, or at least a proxy for that, right? And then we also have like a few other like nuanced things that probably aren't really worth getting into. But then we also do like physical modeling and computer simulation modeling for biomechanics, right? So that's literally doing the manual thing of moving bones around and measuring things, and then using a computer simulation program that's meant to do the same thing, and then trying to run a simulation to estimate changes in muscle length and muscle force, etc. So which is a lot of what you see in the biomechanics research is these days in terms of like movements and stuff, is a lot of it is using sim models, right? Which have a lot of limitations to them, but they're just the tool that we have at the time.
So when you try to compare, for example, the EMG and was it called the NOx, or was it called when trying to measure?
So we have two devices for NIRS. We have a Moxie monitor, and then we have an NX monitor, right? They're both different. Then the NX is a little bit better technology, but the Moxie, I can use more of them simultaneously. So I kind of use both, right?
So if you try to determine like prime mover in an exercise, which would be better, in an EMG or NOx or Moxie?
I wouldn't say one is better, and I wouldn't say either is perfectly adequate. I think what's valuable for us is having both of those data points so that we can see consistency between the two, right? Because neither is perfect. The EMG gives us a little bit more precision than the NIRS data does. Like we're able to measure like more specific regions, than we are with the Moxie or the NIRS, right? I mean, basically think of it this way, is like with the EMG, we're able to like set sensors along like a fiber line, whereas like with the NIRS data, where it's just shooting like a radius of light in and measuring how that light reflects back. So once we start trying to do things like separate out middle delts and stuff like that, I just can't be confident that the Moxie data is giving me the precision that I need. And that happens for EMG too, once we start looking at things that are close enough together. And then our EMG is surface. So like I can't measure muscles that are underneath, like I can't measure something that I would need a fine wire where you'd have to go through like the rhomboids or something.
Let's try to find some kind of correlation between the two.
Yes. So basically I look for the biomechanic modeling to line up with what we're doing with the EMG and with the NIRS, right? And then also the in the gym training experience. So it's like if I can check all four of those boxes, I become fairly confident that, okay, this is having the effect that I want in the absence of actual hypertrophy data, right? So
Okay,
that's kind of what we were looking at, right? Because none of these are perfect. So I'm just hoping that if I have enough not perfect proxies, that's the best way that I can inform the decision-making process in the absence of actual applied hypertrophy research. Because if we're just waiting for applied hypertrophy research for everything, well, I'm going to be dead before we know like even 10% more of the body. So that's not really going to be that helpful.
So can you check 4 boxes when saying that the lats does depression of the scapula?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, we'll
All
go
right.
into that now.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think, as you also texted to us, it would be great also to get like the terminology just right. So meanings have words, and I think it's quite important when you go into a discussion that you agree on at least that boundary or that set. So that would be regarding, as you wrote, indirect versus independent actions, etc. So would you kind of just line up your terminology for the different stuff we're going to talk about today?
Yeah. So I think one of the problems when you're getting into this level of discussion is, yes, using the right terminology, and then also like interchanging the words as you speak and applying a meaning that they don't. So people say that the lats don't attach directly to the scapula, which, in some people they do, some people they don't, whatever. Uh, but when we're talking about an exercise like a pull down, for example, the load is going through the arm, right? And so, like, the fact that we do or do not attach directly to the scapula is kind of irrelevant to the biomechanical consequence that the lats are pulling downward on the humerus, right? So just because something is indirect doesn't mean that it has a weak action. And so I think so indirect just means that, okay, it's creating movement at a joint, but not by pulling on that specific bone. So for example, let's say you're doing a dumbbell curl. Your bicep does not attach to the bone in your hand where the weight is on, right? Like you're lifting that dumbbell through a variety of joints. We're flexing the elbow, right? That's the joint that we're moving, but we still the force from that dumbbell is crossing across the hand bones, the wrist bones, etc., and all of those muscles that are involved in stabilizing that are also. But we wouldn't be like, well, the biceps aren't a very good elbow flexor, for in dumbbell curls because they don't directly attach to the hand bones that the dumbbell is touching, right? So same thing here. It's just like, okay, the lats don't directly attach to the scapula, they don't directly attach to the clavicle, but that doesn't mean that they can't have a significant effect there, right? And so that the other term that kind of goes is like, okay, they act on it indirectly, right? And an indirect action, again, is just a description of location, not a description of magnitude, right? We could go through the body in a whole different examples of where, like, hey, things act indirectly on something without touching it, but they have a significant, impact of force around a joint, right? The other ones, I think is there's a difference between talking about joint action and forces versus joint torque. So when we look at torque, that's basically the rotational force that's being created around something. So I think when we say action, it implies movement. When we say torque, it implies force. So I think one of the things that was confusing about this, and I think this actually, came from the example of trying to look at the quads and how the rec fem, is similar to the lats, because with something like this, for whatever, the lats are a complicated muscle, one, because it's a big fan-shaped muscle. It crosses a whole bunch of joints. People can't see it. The shoulder joint and the scapula are very complicated motions. So sometimes when communicating this stuff, I try and break it down to simpler joints or muscles that people could like conceptualize, so that we can like work step by step to understanding like the mechanics that are going on. And so like we're talking about a two joint muscle, people, and trying to describe like, hey, if a muscle is contracting across multiple joints, it's going to create torque at all of those joints, but it won't necessarily create action depending on what else is going on. So, for instance, we'll just go back to the bicep curl, right? The bicep is also somewhat of a weak shoulder flexor, if you will. Okay, whether there's actual shoulder flexion from bicep tension is just dependent on whether or not that's enough to move the shoulder forward, or whether or not there's other muscles that are antagonizing the shoulder muscle. Like if my rear delt holds the shoulder back, then basically the humerus will stay still and I'll only flex at the elbow. And that's what happens down at the leg too. Like if I contract my rec fem, if I want to just extend my knee, then basically something on the posterior chain, my glutes or something, will just contract just enough to stop the hip flexion so that the rec fem can do exclusively knee extension. So the action is happening at one joint, but the rec fem is still producing force across both joints. So there's a difference between, hey, right now this muscle tension is going to create force like across all the joints that it can act on, but action is only going to occur when basically that force exceeds whatever resistance there is, whether that resistance is an external weight or from our own musculature holding one end of that joint still. Okay. So then I think the next one I had on here is like direct versus indirect joint action. And this is very similar to like that, indirect for independent. So a direct action would be, okay, I attach to a bone, I pull on that bone moves. Indirect is basically, it's like, okay, I pull on this bone, but somewhere else in the kinetic chain is the thing that I'm talking about, and that's happening, but not due to a direct attachment, so to speak. Now, I don't want to get overly technical on this, but like attachment, like technically, like a direct attachment from like a physiology term means that the muscle actually comes in and like fuses into the bone. Like an indirect attachment means that it converts into a tendon and then to the bone. So I don't care, like on social media, if people say direct and indirect, like plainly. But when people are being like, "Oh, look, if you pull up a screenshot of something and says, hey, this doesn't directly attach, and it's from a textbook where they're using a different meaning of what directly attachment means. Well, if you go by the textbook terms, most muscles don't directly attach to bones. They form tendons or ligaments or, aponeuroses or whatever, right? And then not ligaments, that was a bad term. Ligaments is bone to bone, but tendons or aponeuroses or whatever. But the connective tissue forms and then connects into the bone. The muscle fibers don't make it all the way to the bone. And that's the textbook term. So just be careful if somebody throws up a screenshot from a study or a textbook and it says this doesn't directly attach, and just think, wait a second, which are we talking like the simple, like if, two people are on the, street or like, oh, it doesn't directly attach because it actually attaches somewhere else in terms of location versus, oh, this is just being described as the connective tissue is a separation between the bone and the actual contractile tissue. Let me know if I'm getting too technical on these things, right?
It was perfect.
Yeah.
Then there's the like, does a muscle cross a joint or not cross a joint? And I think an easy way to do this, and there's not like, this is something that I don't think there are like firm definitions written out on the research or anything. The way I kind of try and explain it is we have anatomical crossing and functional crossing, where anatomical basically means like you can very visibly see that there's an axis and the thing like, crosses that. Functional crossing means that basically the kinetic chain is going to be acted on by this joint. Okay. So all that basically means is that you visibly see the joint in between the muscles connection points in anatomical crossing very easily, whereas you may not always see that, and it may still be functionally crossing. So for example, with the lats, they attach to the humerus and then they go down to the ribs, the iliac crest, the lumbar and thoracic spine. Okay. And so you don't see them make it up to the clavicle or the scapula, but those exist in the chain. Like the kinetic chain for the lats is essentially everything from your spine all the way back out to the humerus. So if you draw a loop, and I can send you guys an image if you want to throw it over the video here, of basically it's like, all right, the functional kinetic chain here of the lats pulling down on the arm affects every joint going from the humerus all the way to the spine. Right now, there's context where, again, some of those joints may get an action and others may not, depending on what's going on in terms of external constraints or internal tension of antagonist muscles, etc. Right. But when we're talking like about a pull down exercise, like we're simply going to be looking at, okay, how much force is there that's actually pulling up on the sternoclavicular joint versus how much am I doing in terms of abduction, flexion, and the lats are going to be acting on both of those simultaneously. What motion occurs is going to be relative to the resistance and the total forces of everything that's kind of working together in there. But the lats basically, they cannot produce force to adduct or to flex, or I'm sorry, extend the shoulder, right, at the glenohumeral joint without also creating that force through the rest of the chain, right? So the only reason that the lats would do an isolated glenohumeral motion is something would have to stop the other parts of the chain from working. And then same thing vice versa, right? If you do an isolated depression exercise, the main thing that's going to stop you from bending down is that, well, you're going to have some load in your hand and you're going to be utilizing less teres and less rear delt because those muscles aren't going to pull the shoulder down, but they would help do the extension. So if they let go, your relative force to do extension is less. So the action doesn't occur as much as that joint as it does the joint that you're trying to move, which in this case, which would be like the sternoclavicular joint to do depression or, retraction actions, right? So all you're doing basically in that instance is you're shifting more tension to the muscles that act on the joint you want to move and fewer of them that work on the one that you don't want to move. But in the case of the lats, it's going to be acting on both, right? So if you had too light of a load, it would be very hard to do just the sternoclavicular joint if you had no resistance in the arm, because there'd be nothing stopping you from also doing the extension at the same time. Same thing like if you contracted your rec fem in space, right? Outer space, no gravity, no nothing, and no other muscles were active, you would do hip flexion and knee extension at the same time because there would be nothing stopping one of the joints from moving.
Makes sense.
All right.
Yeah, so you're kind of thinking of it as like more of a rigid body, so you keep the same like joint angle and the shoulder, but if that's rigid, then the lats would be able to do this stuff. Right, so just also thinking at like the elbow when doing elbow flexion with a dumbbell in your hand, when you keep the wrist rigid, then you're gonna move it like that. Or is that kind of the same thing you're?
If you want to get to the exercise you're doing specifically, it's slightly different in context when you're coming down and holding the 90 degrees. It gets a little bit more complicated because then in that case, we do have the external resistance creating a lot of torque at the glenohumeral joint. Like there's a lot of resistance pulling you into shoulder flexion or abduction at that point. So in that instance, what you're trying to do is you're trying to maintain enough force at that joint to maintain basically a horizontal humerus position. And so it's not the same as the external force doing that all on its own, where like if you have your arm up overhead with a heavy weight, you can do like a depression action and you don't have to really think that much about not bending the elbow down. You can kind of isolate those two together. You're going to be using proportionately more of the delts and the teres to hold the isometric if we do the same shoulder action, but at 90 degrees, because we're doing it in a position where there is more resistance at the glenohumeral joint. Whereas when we're up over here, the external resistance at the glenohumeral joint relative to this joint, the ratio significantly changes in favor of there being more load pulling up on the shoulder than there is trying to continue to flex or abduct at that point. So where you do this is going to drastically change how much the different muscles are contributing and also the coordination that's needed to do it.
Okay, makes sense. We can see that our meeting, because we do not have Zoom Pro, will end in 9 minutes, but we can just take some questions until then, and then we can start a new meeting, if that's okay with you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do have it. So if you want me to initiate the next one so that it goes, then we can do that.
That would be awesome.
Yeah, that would be good.
Okay. Sorry, you should have.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We did not know. We haven't used Zoom before, so
Yeah.
How bad? Okay.
Okay. Should we, as you said in the text, that we should start with like the video and then one statement at a time and address that? Okay. In Jackson's video, first of all, Jackson made a video on Victor and me, and it was a great video. Nothing to shame Jackson about that. And the first thing he said was, lats don't have a strong action on the scapula or the sternoclavicular joint. And
So
yeah.
yeah. So, and this is where I think the terms get mixed up, right? So, because I think the assumptions he's making is because the lats don't directly act on the scapula, he's conflating indirectness with strength, right? So his conclusion is basically because the action is indirect, it is not strong. And I don't think that is a sound argument in this instance. And also I think that we tend to talk about movements like putting my arm up and down in this motion, elevation and depression. We tend to talk about that in terms of the scapula just to simplify, because in reality it's like, is that motion just scapular elevation and depression? No, it's the humerus is elevating and depressing, the clavicle is rotating, like, so we just simplify it by just calling it scapular elevation and depression. And I think that if you just look at it as isolating to the scapula, then maybe that's how that works out in your head of like, oh, because it doesn't attach directly. And it's like, well, no, the whole shoulder complex is moving up and down or forward and back when we're doing these motions, and the resistance is going through the arm. So I think people get hung up on, well, it has to directly pull on the scapula, and it's like, well, no. Actually, pulling on the scapula would be one of the least efficient ways for the body to manage, a force through your arm. The closer I can get to where the resistance is, the more directly I can act on the resistance. So actually having the lats act on the humerus is a more direct way of dealing with the elevation forces in the top of a pull down than having something pulling on the scapula, which would then have to go through the rotator cuff to then pull on the humerus, right? And the other thing is that by attaching to the humerus, okay, it's not only more efficient in terms of like just being more closer to the resistance, but the lat force contributes to both motions, meaning you basically, for the same amount of lat tension, you get some of the shoulder extension action and some of the sternoclavicular action. If I had to do those two things separately, I would have to pay for each of them both individually. Like I would have to pay for the tension of those two things in isolation. Whereas when the lats are working, basically that same force gets to be applied to both of those joint actions. So from a mechanics and an efficiency standpoint, having the lats attach where they do makes them extremely good for those type of activities, because I get kind of a 2-for-1 special on the energy and force that I put into the lats.
That's probably the same with the bicep, right? Doing a bicep curl. So it's also energy efficient when it comes to not letting the elbow extend behind the torso.
Yeah, it's more so than just extending. So if you are holding a weight in your hand, what the bicep's doing is it's actually keeping your shoulder joint from falling out of socket. Right. So think of it is your bicep is actually working harder to pull the top of the humerus into the scapula, like fossa there. Right. It's working harder to do that than it is actually to flex the elbow in that situation. So essentially, when you curl, your body gets to use whatever work the biceps are doing to lift the weight. It gets to use that same tension to stabilize the shoulder at the same time, right? Which means that my rotator cuff doesn't have to work as hard, my shoulder integrity is better, et cetera. So there's lots of ways where the body utilizes, like it repurposes the force that you're trying to do to a movement to also create the stability that we need to support those movements. It's one of the reasons that we have two joint muscles, instead of just all single joint muscles, is we get this kind of benefit of the same muscular work contributing benefits in two places.
Okay. Yeah. Should we go to the next statement? And it was, what is the significance of the attachment or non-attachment directly to the scapula?
Yeah. So he references a study where they looked at like in what percentage of people the lat comes up and attaches to the very bottom or the inferior portion of the scapula. And when it comes to looking at anatomical research, is one disclaimer I like to put out there is that you're looking at elderly populations in most of this stuff, and dissection is very challenging. So I think the data is not as good. But let's just pretend that in 0% of people that the scapula or that the lat ever attached to the scapula. In this instance, it's not significant to the question being asked because that small little sliver of the lat that would attach to the bottom of the scapula would have more of a rotational, force vector on the scapula. And it's such a small portion that like it wouldn't be doing a significant amount of the force, right? Like the majority of the lat fibers would still be running to the humerus, and only like a small sliver of them would actually be attaching to the scapula. So I think what's happening there is, again, it's going back to like, well, if it doesn't directly connect, that means it must not have a strong action. And so what you're trying to do is position, well, most people don't have this direct connection. Therefore, most people, it wouldn't be a strong connection. And I think you're just conflating, an anatomical thing with a force thing. And they, in this instance, one does not mean the other.
Yes. Should we go to the next one?
Mhm.
The next statement was muscles, lower traps, serratus anterior, pec minor are listed as having a direct action of the scapula without regard of the specificity or magnitude.
So, and this came up in my debate with Scientific Snitch too. Is like, so there's other muscles that can depress the scapula, right? But all of the muscles that attach to the scapula and move it, they don't do just depression like it's this ambiguous motion. What they will do is in terms of pulling down, they'll also be trying to rotate the scapula. So the lower trap rotates the scapula in the opposite direction that it moves during a pull down. So that means from a specificity standpoint that essentially it's like, well, one of the motions works with the muscle and one of them works against that muscle at that point in time. And that tends to lead to, well, we're just not going to use that as much because essentially what would happen is if I use more lower trap, I would have to then also counter rotate the scapula. Now, there is going to be some of that happening. So the rhomboid is a downward rotator, but it is a retractor and elevator of the scapula. So you will get this instance where you have a force couple where it's like, okay, the rhomboid is trying to pull the bottom of the scapula towards the spine, whereas the lower trap would be pushing the bottom of the scapula away from the spine. Those two can kind of contract at the same time in hope of balancing the rotation and allowing, some depression, but you are kind of fighting each other. So you're not going to probably maximize recruitment there. Because you need the scapula still to go through its downward rotation. Whereas the tension from the lats is going to lead to a downward rotation force because what it's going to do is it's going to push down on the lateral side of the scapula.
So I think were you done with that almost? Yeah.
No, I have to
Oh,
cover a couple of the other muscles, right?
okay. Yeah. Oh yeah, sorry.
Right. So the other muscles that kind of fit in this kind of same category of they do depression, but not necessarily in the way that would say suit these exercises. If we look at the serratus anterior, the serratus anterior is also a upward rotator. And only the lowest portion of it would be able to do like the depression action, like a large portion of the serratus anterior pulls the scapula into upward rotation and actually forward, and some of it even upward. So if we look at like EMG activity of the serratus anterior, it's extremely active and literally doing the opposite motion of a pull down. Like if you do a raise where you're protracting and elevating, you will see a lot of serratus anterior. Like it's the boxer muscle, often labeled as such, because it's very good at protracting the shoulder and rotating it upward. So the specificity of the serratus anterior is even less so than the lower trapezius, right? And then you have muscles on the front side of the body, like the pectoralis major and minor, that can also depress at the sternoclavicular joint, but those muscles are going to pull the shoulder girdle anteriorly to do so. And so if we're trying to use the lats, we're trying to depress, but we're also depressing it like a backward angle, or we're trying to do retraction at a downward angle. Like you have this like kind of spectrum of like mostly depression versus mostly retraction, but if it's lats, it's going to be a combination of both. In both cases, there's going to be more depression if you're focusing on lower lats, a little bit more retraction if we're focusing on upper lats, but always still kind of a down and back combination to some degree. And so that the lats, their pull on the sternoclavicular joint, that it's very specific to not only the direction of the clavicle, but also the rotation of this scapula, right? So the lats are specific to both of those things, right? And we get that 2-for-1 special of like, okay, it's acting on, the humerus being loaded there. It also is not forcing you to transfer all of that stress through the rotator cuff and the AC joint by being able to pull somewhat on the humerus directly, etc. So no matter how you kind of like try and look at the reasoning, there really isn't an argument for anything that would provide a better solution to doing the depression or retraction action in that lat plane than the lats themselves. So these other muscles for sure are going to be somewhat active, but if we look at the EMG data that we do have, we don't see the lower traps having their greatest activity in depression exercises. It's like a Y raise exercise is actually the exercise that will see the greatest activity in the lower trapezius, which is quite the opposite of a pull down, right? Like like the main action there that the lower traps are doing is that scapular rotation, right? That upward rotation, but they're doing the upward rotation with depression at the same time in something like a Y raise where the shoulder is being pulled, back and in while rotating upward, right? And if we compare that to a pull down, right, or if even we compare certain row variations, to a pull down or a pull up exercise, there's one dissertation study, I believe it was, where you see the lower traps are like less active in the pull down variations than they are in these other more upper back or raisey type motions. So it doesn't mean that the lower traps aren't contributing, but far from maximally, right? And I would think that if the lats were really bad at doing this job, then we would basically need maximum lower traps to be able to handle all of that force, right? And then you can also consider just you have the specificity relative to the actual muscular force. So something's ability to act on a joint is going to be a combination of basically how specific its action is and then what its total muscular force is, right? And so when we're talking like, okay, we're just using the lower traps or just using the bottom of the serratus or we're just using the pec minor, like the lats have a pretty decent size relative to some of these other muscles, probably in most trained people. If we look at cadaver studies, the lats are oftentimes going to be, we'll say, they're going to be represented smaller than normal, right? You probably don't see a lot of 80-year-old people walking around with huge jacked lats. So what you'll tend to see is like in very old people, proportionately, they'll have like bigger delts and trap muscles and stuff that they use in the limited movement that they do. But they're not doing a lot of pull downs, chin ups, and in row type motions. So you'll see underdevelopment of the pecs and the lats, and things like that, and overdevelopment of like delts and forearms and stuff. So just be careful when you're looking at like muscle volume or, total tension studies in, the population that we have for cadaver studies and how that relates to a young resistance trained individual who's going to have very different, we'll say, muscular proportions, right? Like, the Olympia was this last weekend, right? I don't think most people can look at that and be like, yeah, this dude's serratus, his inferior fibers of his serratus anterior are probably just as big as his lats. Like, probably not, right? Like if anyway.
But I could imagine that a counter argument could be that, for example, in the serratus anterior, that in the beginning of the depression movement, perhaps just like the deltoid, it has subdivisions, so it can be the posterior part can have an antagonistic effect on the anterior deltoid. Perhaps we just innovate purely the more vertical serratus anterior fibers in the beginning of the movement. What would your an argument be for that, or do you agree with that counter argument if they had that?
Well, I'm sure actually that does happen to a little degree. But keep in mind that the smaller portion of that you're using, the less force it can contribute, right? And the more that you have to counter that, basically you're kind of taking away some of the force that it can provide. And what we tend to see is the body doesn't like to utilize things where there's a cost of, like, it's like, okay, I can utilize this, but then I have to use extra muscles and extra energy to antagonize it. What we tend to see is the body really likes to use things that directly act on things, right? So this is kind of the difference between the way that I look at biasing muscles versus the neuromechanical matching model. Is like the neuromechanical matching model, as it is like described on social media, is like just leverage, but it doesn't cover like all possible force vectors. They basically look at leverage in one plane as if this is the only joint that moves and this is the only place that there's force, and that there's no other actions that any of these muscles are taking place or acting on. And in this case, the lats, their job in this instance matches the specificity in both cases, meaning that if I just could activate just lats, I wouldn't have to activate other things as much to counteract the force of the lats because their action is specific to the task. Whereas if I'm using more lower traps, or if I'm using more serratus anterior, or if I'm using more pec minor, like all of those are going to require me to do some antagonist action in part to be able to utilize the depression force of those muscles, right? So in order for me to utilize the depression force of the serratus anterior, I have to counter the rotation and the protraction. Same thing for the pecs, right? If I were to use the pecs to help pull the arm down, right? And the pecs do depression and shoulder extension from a certain degree, but they also pull the sternoclavicular joint forward. So this is why, like, okay, in a pullover exercise, we can see a lot of lower pecs at the beginning of the movement. But in that movement, like if you're doing a lying dumbbell pullover, you're actually pushing forward. Like the protraction is what's being loaded, not retraction, right? So that's the big difference between doing, shoulder extension when you're pushing out in front of you versus doing shoulder extension in a pull down where you're also pulling the weight, somewhat behind you, or you're driving your elbow like to the backside of your hip instead of down in front of you. So like if you were to do a pull down and you were to try and push your elbow towards your mid thigh, you'd find that you use a lot more lower pec because you're like kind of maintaining this protraction. All you do is you pull your elbow towards towards your glute med, right? Or your upper glute max, like just towards the back of your iliac crest. And now all of a sudden you see that the chest, it doesn't go off completely because it's still going to help a little bit, but it's significantly less because you are having to pay for that cost of, well, the pec is going to want to push the shoulder forward and the lats are going to want to pull the shoulder back, which is more specific to the task. So these other things are like you have to stabilize and manage all of the joints and all of the forces. So things aren't going to go like likely to zero, but they are going to decrease significantly in their contribution. And then the other thing, because we're talking about, usually in this case, we're talking about hypertrophy, right? Is also just the range of motion that we're going through. So keep in mind that in some of these things, it's like, okay, if we're shortening them at one action and lengthening them at the other action, like if we're doing downward rotation and depression, how much range of motion are we getting out of something like the serratus anterior or the lower traps, where we're basically working opposite of their action and rotation and one thing and the other? So we're essentially shortening the range of motion that those guys would be going through during the exercise as well. And one of the ways that we like kind of estimate like the leverage that something has is how much change in length there is relative to the joint angle change, right? Now, obviously, this is more complicated because you have lots of joints involved, but in general, we can just look at the lat length change in doing these exercises is going to be significantly greater than these other muscles where basically they're kind of being antagonized in one action or the other, right? Kind of like, all right, if you do a squat type motion, your hamstring length may not change much, even though you're doing hip extension because you're also doing knee extension. right? Here, okay, you're doing depression, but you're also doing downward rotation. And so that's going to be antagonist to the length change of the lower traps and the stratus anterior at one, even though it fits for the other.
So it's a kind of guideline if how lengthy and how shortened the muscle will get. Because I think you would also say that a deadlift will also target the rectus spinae and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like a guidance you use, but it's not like the complete way to use it.
We have to use it in comparison, right? Because if you're talking about the spine, right, you'd only compare it to other spinal extensors. So it's imagine that there was a spinal extensor where when we were doing a deadlift, it changed length more than the other spinal extensors. Then it could be like, oh, well, maybe that one is making more of a difference here, right? But you wouldn't compare a spinal extensor to a hip extensor, right? Because so basically it's like if we have to compare what's happening around the same joints to each other, not just something over here, something over there, right? So in a deadlift, yes, the spinal erectors are being loaded, but they're not going through very much range of motion. Okay, that that doesn't mean that their relevance in the exercise is in that way comparable to the hip extensor range of motion of the glutes or the adductors or whatnot, because they're doing a different thing. They're managing different joints, right? So in that instance, it's like, yes, and I mean, can you grow muscle doing just isometrics? Yes, right. But when we're talking comparatively within a condition, if one muscle is just kind of holding length and another muscle is actually going through the phase, I'm going to assume that the thing that is changing length is what's kind of doing the action of the exercise more. So if you're doing a deadlift, the that hopefully your deadlift is not a spinal flexion extension exercise. So I'm
Sometimes.
hoping the thing that's actually helping you move the weight up and down is your hip extensors, right? Are we getting stimulus in the erector spinae? Yes, right? But do you do deadlifts to isolate the spinal extensors? No, right? You usually do it as a lower body exercise. If we wanted to isolate the spinal extensors, what we would do, we would probably do something where we flexed and extended the spine, right? Or we would do an isometric in a way where basically the spinal extension would be the limiting factor and it would give out like it would reach failure before our hip extensors would, right?
Makes sense. You would just clarify when it comes to things like which holds an isometric, like the rectus spinae. The next question, yeah, you feel like your lats are contracting, but it's probably your serratus anterior, or the next statement, I should say.
Yeah. Um, well, what people feel is very subjective, for one. Um, and I don't think most people really have a very good perceptual awareness of their serratus anterior. So I I just think this is a very weak claim. That's unsubstantiated because how do you tell somebody or how do you determine that somebody feels their serratus anterior versus feeling their lats? I think when it comes to like lats and back and stuff, people tend to have, we'll say, poor they have poor I would say mind muscle connection in terms of feeling what they're using because we just tend to be better at understanding the muscles that we see in the mirror and the stuff on our back we're less consciously aware of it, right? um, so if you're getting to the point where you could feel the inferior fibers of your serratus anterior more and you couldn't distinguish that something was pulling on the front lower ribs relative to something that's on the backside of your body, that's pretty poor mind muscle connection. If you can't like it's literally we're getting to the point where it's like one thing is going to feel more like it's on the side in front of your body and attaching down to the ribs and the other thing's going to feel like it's on the portion of like your lower back and love handle area. So I just think the claim is a little bit BS. And two, I also think like that subjective, like, well, you feel it here, it's not this, or you think it's this and that. It's absolutely a possibility that people mess up what they're feeling on their back all the time. Like they don't know the difference between, a lat and a lower trap or a spinal erector or an oblique. Like, yes, all of that's possible. but it becomes less likely that they feel a muscle on the more anterior lateral side of the body than the muscles on the posterior side of the body or the dorsal side of the body, right?
Yeah,
Makes
makes
sense.
sense. So this is kind of one of the large points of the argument. I think also Jackson tried to get a biomechanics student involved regarding the moment arm lines drawn from the lats to the sternoclavicular joint. And I think, well, we can probably argue they are not. We'll probably agree on that they're not totally accurate, maybe, but how much of it like goes away from like moving through the joint to the AC joint and translating the force through there. So their kind of argument is you cannot draw it like that. But I think we are more at the point where we think like, okay, yeah, that's probably right. You probably can't just draw that exact line, but how much of an effect does it take away from it? And we have a hard time trying to calculate that. So we didn't really try, but so that's kind of their argument. And but what do you think? Like what can you say? What's like the what can you say? Like how much of an influence do you think it has that it has to go through more joints, like when drawing the moment arm? Do you think it's like 1/3? Because that's what we tried to like look at. It would maybe drop to like 1/3 of what it really was when drawn that just straight line. But what's the influence there, and how much do you think it matters?
Well, I think the first thing comes to asking the right question of what you want from what you're trying to illustrate. Because when we're trying to determine like this is where if you're looking at this as like, oh, the scapular depression, and therefore I have to measure the force that's on the scapula, or I have to measure the force that's at the sternoclavicular joint versus how much work are the lats doing in this exercise, because we are depressing the humerus, we are downwardly rotating the scapula. The scapula is depressing the sternal. Like, is is the answer to, hey, is this going to be good for my lats, a measurement of the exact torque at any one of those joints? Not necessarily, right? It is kind of the sum. Now, with the simple line drawing, here's the assumption that you have to make is that you have to make the assumption that in this context, that everything inside the joint is going to be relatively rigid and controlled. And if we look at what scapulohumeral rhythm is, that's essentially kind of what's going to happen. Like your scapula can't just freely move up and down if you keep the clavicle and the humerus still. Like if you keep the humerus in place, your clavicle and your scapula have to be in a pretty tightly controlled position. So essentially, all of the musculature that's managing the clavicle and the scapula more directly by attachment or whatever, or more specifically in terms of managing the scapular humeral rhythm in this case, those muscles are creating the rigidity in essentially everything that is more proximal from the glenohumeral joint. And so the difference in terms of like the practical outcome between drawing the simple line and us doing the advanced calculation is probably insignificant. Okay. Now, can we pull numbers like torque numbers of all of those joints based off of that simple line drawing? No, we cannot. Right. But also, I don't think people realize that when it comes to modeling something like that, when it comes to getting those reaction forces and stuff, you actually have to have all of the individual data points. So that means you can only calculate for the exact position with all of the forces, meaning that in that instance, in order to actually calculate that, you have to know exactly how much every muscle is acting on a joint, right? So that means you'd have to know exactly what the muscular force of the lats is, what the muscular force of the traps is, everything and its antagonist. Because when we get into reaction forces, you're going to basically have things that are basically, okay, it's rotating this way, but it's creating something here. You would have to know the forces for every single muscle, the exact anatomy, And you would only then be able to make conclusions based off of that one position not moving. Okay. So this is why the computer simulation models are what people do when we get to this level of biomechanics, because nobody can do that by hand, and you have to have the variables, put in there. So this is what I tried to do with like OpenSim to kind of show a little bit of like, what's going on. But there's still like tons of limitations, because in OpenSim, and all of these models, they're estimating muscular force based off of cadaver data and EMG, right? So I think the standard that's being set for if you want to say this, we expect you to have all of this math, and like literally there's no other instance where somebody is asking for that level of of nuance, right? And oftentimes the people that are asking for it are the furthest away from understanding what they're asking for. Like they don't realize how limited the context is, the limitations of the best, simulation model that we could do, right? And then basically it's like, look, because if I did that model for one of you in one position, it would not apply to the other one, because your humerus is going to be a little bit different length. Your lat to lower trap ratio is going to be a little bit like, basically, if we're talking about that nuance, like it would have to be the exact person. I'd have to have data that we can't even get right. Right. Like I can't actually measure your absolute muscular force with EMG. I can just say, hey, based off of how big the muscle is and what here, I'm assuming that maybe we're getting this percentage of the theoretical force it could produce, right? And that's even having to account for things like the sarcomere length, how elastic the tendon is at that point in time, et cetera. Like the complication scales exponentially. So this is why the line drawing, I think, is like, hey, this shows generally what's going to happen, right? The necessary complexity to work out those small little details is like orders of magnitude over and over and over again more complicated to basically say like, oh, yes, it's still true, but here's the exact percentages and ratios. Okay. The simple way of looking at this is we use the length thing. And so if we simply model a pull down or we model depression or whatnot, we can see the relative length change in these things. And then we can rely on our proxy data of looking at things like the EMG. And when we look at the EMG stuff, okay, everything that involves more depression uses more of the lower lats. Everything that involves more retraction utilizes more of the upper lats, right? And this is pretty much true across all of the research that we have, right? And then same thing, if we look at EMG for the other muscles, we don't see that the lower traps are the strongest in the context of depression. We see the serratus anterior actually being mostly active in motions that are literally the opposite of a rowing type motion. So they have more of an antagonistic role at the scapula than the lats, even though in this context they could be contributing synergistically a little. It's only going to be at a fraction of what their potential is. So I don't think that of the available evidence that we do have, that there's anything to suggest that we need a lot more than the simple drawing to be able to illustrate that. Does that mean that I'm going to say, hey, I'm absolutely 100% confident on all of the force calculations in between there? No, like not even close. But if you do attempt to model it a little bit, for at least, I know some people that haven't looked into it in detail, and it's like 50-50 in terms of what their guess is. As soon as people start actually looking into the reactionary forces and stuff, most people are like, okay, yes. And it's also understanding the context of what the real question is. Because the question is that we're not trying to figure out exactly how much torque there is at the sternoclavicular joint. What we're really trying to figure out is like, okay, how much is the lat contributing to this action that happens all the way out on the humerus, right? It's just that the sternoclavicular joint happens to be the point where the arm is anchored to the body. So when we're talking about this motion, that is the most appropriate axis to talk about where the motion occurs even though we're acting on the humerus directly and not acting on the sternoclavicular joint directly, right? And that maybe in between there, like joint forces can get a little bit wonky because of all the reaction forces. That doesn't mean that, hey, the thing that's pulling on the humerus directly is actually what's doing the majority of the work here.
Makes sense. We found
Good,
some
because I was
also
worried
found some
nobody's going to understand that.
we also found some data which showed the degrees of rotation from the SC joint and the AC joint when it came to lateral and medial rotation of the scapula. If we talk purely elevation depression, then there will also be some kind of lateral rotation and medial rotation of the scapula. Um, so when there is rotation through two different kind of joints, would that change where we should place the axis when trying to determine internal moment arm and so on? So, for example, one study I looked at, we saw more degrees of rotation from the AC joint compared to the SC joint during a lateral rotation of the scapula. Would that move the axis we try to determine internal moment arm off closer to the AC joint, or would it still be closer to the SC joint because it's probably what it pivots around when doing depression elevation? If that makes sense at all.
So technically, those are just two different moment arms that are happening at the same time, right?
Yeah.
So it's not that you would look at more of one or the other, because if you're trying to just do a simple model from the lats, what you're assuming is the AC joint, that motion is relatively fixed or controlled, meaning that it has to be at a certain position in order for the humerus to be at that position. So this is where like the semi-rigid thing comes in. So essentially what we're doing is we're just in a sense, we're kind of ignoring that joint exists, in the sense that we're saying, hey, I don't have the ability to independently move this joint, because if I pull down on the humerus, the consequence is that joint just has to come along, right? This is where, like, when people are like, oh, there's scapulohumeral rhythm, and they try and use that as a way of kind of debunking this idea, it's actually the opposite of, like, the fact that we have to control the rhythm of the scapular rotation relative to the clavicle and humerus means that, well, what's managing that joint, right, is essentially a slave to what we're doing at the others, right? Like our scapula can't be out of rotation for a given humeral position. So this is where like the semi-rigid, so it's moving, but its movement is restricted, right, to basically having to be a slave to correlate with where the humerus is in space. So if we're pulling the humerus down, then basically the scapula is going to have to come with it, even though other muscles are helping to manage the forces at that axis as well, right? So
So what you're saying is that it's like when you move one joint, the other one will move like simultaneously. Like when you look at the sternoclavicular joint, AC joint, ST joint.
yeah,
When you move one of them, you have to move the other
it's
ones
not
as well.
just that it will move, it's that it has to move, and it has to move proportionately, right? So it's that its movement is literally dependent on correlating with the other position. Right. So that's where, because just because it can move or will move is different than, hey, actually, this can only be in the position that also supports the humeral position. So there's limited degrees of freedom between humerus position and scapular rotation, especially if we also have a certain clavicular position. So because of that limited freedom, it means that what's happening inside the glenohumeral joint is working as like a semi-rigid complex. It's not a free moving thing. It has to maintain basically a certain degree of rigidity to be able to maintain its appropriate position relative, to the humerus. What I'd suggest, and I mean, if you guys are trying to calculate this stuff, my guess is that
we didn't really.
Okay.
It was
Because
half-assed, put it into ChatGPT, and I was like, nah, that can't be right, and then I quit.
yeah, I don't trust ChatGPT like at all. Even the most basic questions, it like gives terrible answers. But yeah, I would say that like when you're looking at this stuff, if you want to just kind of like go through the process of seeing how different things would be applying force across different joints, like in terms of what directions they would be moving things. That can be a useful thought exercise as to understanding the specificity, right? But in terms of trying to apply magnitude of force, that's where, like, probably from where you guys are at, like, you guys are going to need to surpass my level of mathematical biomechanics to be able to finish the job, right? So just letting you know, like, but if you're going to pursue that, be careful, because a lot of times what will happen is you'll just get to the end of what you think you know and think you have the solution and not realize that you only have 10% of the solution.
Fuck. But then I also have a question because you said it would have kind of rigid when it comes to the scapulohumeral rhythm. So the humerus follows along with the SC and AC joint, or opposite. What when doing when people does, for example, a pull down, and when they get down to the bottom, and then they start to elevate their shoulder to lengthen the lats and therefore get stronger, better leverage because of length tension relationship. How does that apply to this phenomenon, a strict, rigid scapulohumeral rhythm?
So you have greater degrees of freedom between, like, between the humerus and the scapula in different places, right? So, and also keep in mind that when we're down here and this is coming forward, like, this may not be upward rotation happening at the scapula, but it actually may still be more downward rotation happening, as because this would be like the equivalent of a shrug, right? Which is elevation and downward rotation.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's different degrees of freedom. And this is where you have to look at how the other shoulders, extensors, and adductors are coming into play. So the reason that we would get to a certain position and then we would see the shoulder go up, but still continue to extend, would be that in that instance, our ability or our intention, because it could be either, it could be the technique that the person's trying to do, or it could be the strength, is that in that instance, the combined effect of all of the shoulder extensors and adductors is now exceeding the net depression. So basically, that means that the action of the delts, the teres, and the lats at the glenohumeral joint is currently exceeding the lats, the lower traps, and serratus at the sternoclavicular joint. So essentially, what we're seeing is like, okay, at this position, I'm able to continue to extend the shoulder because all of my shoulder extensors can overcome this force better than here. And which, if you're at the bottom, keep in mind, we have kind of decreased the external challenge for the shoulder flexion extension component. So we've kind of made one motion easy, but like the distance here, the pulling up force has not changed as much, right? Like, so the ratio between those. So you will see that happen. But again, it's still going to be somewhat limited, right? So it's like, okay, what you can do in a shrug with the arm down here, if I bring my arm up, I can shrug to a higher position because now I can upwardly rotate, right? So when we say semi-rigid, it's not 100% rigid, and there's going to be certain positions or orientations where it's more rigid than others. And part of what determines the rigidity is also the forces that are in play. So if I move my arm with no load, I'm going to have a little bit more freedom versus if I actually have resistance that's being acted on that, and then I have to control that. Because keep in mind that if my rear delt and my teres major are acting on the humerus, guess what they attach to? They attach to the scapula. So my teres is now basically trying to pull the bottom of the scapula towards the humerus, right? So then the rhomboid has to force couple with that. So basically, the relationships of all of the rotational forces and stuff will change depending on what position I'm in and which muscles are working on the glenohumeral joint and which muscles are working on the sternoclavicular joint in that position. But it's still within each point of context, there will be a limited degree of freedom. So if I'm here, my scapula can't, my arm is down by my side, my scapula can't just decide to upwardly rotate, right? But it does have some freedom to elevate while still maintaining downward rotation, right? So it's semi-rigid, not completely rigid.
Makes sense. Yeah. Perfect.
Mm.
Because I also thought that could be again, we made the same claims as you did. So we do agree with that the lats do depression of the scapula, but I think a counter argument would be that okay, but when you get down to the bottom, some people do elevation. Is that a co-contraction of the trapezius one and the elevator scapula to like lengthen the lats more and get that extra extension? Yeah, that's what I thought a counter movement could be.
Yeah, I honestly, I think it's probably just the person's intent, right? I think that like I think in that instance, a person is probably just thinking more about getting the elbow back than down. Like all it is that the motion you see is just a result of what the person's trying to do in the exercise. It's their intended technique is resulting in that motion. Because, anytime I've seen that, I can coach somebody out of it just by simply, giving them the appropriate cues. It's not like that has to be the outcome, right? That just ends up being the outcome. If a person's thing is at the bottom, they're more so thinking about doing the shoulder extension and they're not really concerned about driving the elbow down, right? So just like
So
I can get somebody to do just the depression, but I just have to cue them to do it. Because if I just tell them to pull on the handle, what are they going to do? They're going to pull everything because they're going to use all the shoulder extensors. They're even going to use their elbow flexors and whatever because they're going to recruit what they think is needed for the task they're trying to do. And so I think the reason that you probably see that, even though we can talk about what's happening mechanically, the reason that it's happening is likely that's just simply what the person's trying to do because they don't know to do it differently.
yeah, I just thought the argument would be this. Okay, if the lat does depression, then why would it elevate in the bottom? If some people like compensate during the movement, but you mentioned that when the extension exceed the
Yeah.
elevation movement. Yeah.
Okay. So we're kind of limited on time, and I think the last points that he made, it was a bit again regarding the so you made an argument regarding the rec fem, flex the hip without attaching to the femur. Or is there any other points that you kind of want to make before we have to go?
I mean, in terms of like your guys' specific exercise, I don't think we need to go into all of the muscle examples that I disagree with what Jackson's take was or his way of interpreting them. Um,
Mm.
you know, but if we're going to close it up, I would think that we just look at your exercise and evaluate it on its face, right? This is like, okay, is the variation that you chose where you're doing like this 90 degrees, humeral position, right? And then doing the depression from there, would that be the best place to try and bias the lats over the teres or whatnot? And I would say in that instance, like, are you getting a little bit more lats than a regular pull down if we just like talked about the ratio of them moving because you're just doing this motion and you're holding an isometric on the other? It's like maybe, but you're also holding the isometric at essentially where the peak shoulder extension forces are going to be. So if the goal was really to try and train the depression action of the lats, probably with the arm, more overhead, right, with a straight elbow is going to be your place where you would be leveraging more of the depression action and less of the glenohumeral action. Like if you really wanted to bias lats over teres and rear delts, because you're still basically holding a teres and rear delt isometric in the place where there would essentially be the most force there, right? So does that mean it's a bad exercise? No, it just means that if you're doing the exercise with the intent of biasing the lats over the teres, you're moving in that direction, maybe just the smallest possible amount. Whereas if you did it up overhead, you could move in that direction a significant amount, right? Probably there would be an insignificant difference in that instance, of doing that exercise. If we tried to look at a hypertrophy outcome, it'd be very hard to see a difference there, especially in a trained individual, because you're still keeping a lot of muscular tension in those other muscles doing somewhat of an isometric there. And also it's like you were kind of holding the lats at kind of like we're working in them like in a mid to short partial in that position, versus if we're up overhead, then we'd be doing more of a lengthened, partial. And even if you're not, team pro lengthened partial versus full range, for sure there's pretty consistent research that lengthened partials are better than short partials, for what we have now. So if you were going to hedge your bets on, well, should I do a biased exercise that's a lengthened partial versus a biased exercise that's the short partial, I'd probably do the lengthened partial.
But does the shoulder joint angle lengthen the lats much more than, just really focusing on the protraction and shoulder elevation? Does it do much of a difference between those points? Because when we look at it, we kind of because we spent some time also with Tom Purvis talking about this and looking at his model of the lat stuff. And when we kind of look at that, we kind of just see not much of an increase in the lat length, but just really looking at a really quite significant, or I'm not the one to decide if it's significant or not, but a decrease in moment arm when going into higher degrees of shoulder flexion. So we're kind of just focusing on the shoulder elevation and protraction.
Okay, so when the arm goes overhead, the moment arm for what is decreasing?
Oh, it was meant for our exercise.
Yeah.
If we wanted to go higher up, but
not for the only depression
Yeah.
kind of thing. Not for this one.
Okay. So, all right, let's try and unpack that a little bit. If I can try and interpret what you're saying, right? Is you're stopping here, and your reasoning for that is that you think that going higher, you're not getting much more length in the lat, and that you're decreasing the external moment arm. Is that correct?
we try to achieve around 120 degrees of shoulder flexion, but we tend to stop around that because now we feel our lats is about to rip off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I usually see what happens when I go into the maximum kind of elevation and protraction. I start to begin to shortening the lat again by doing some internal rotation.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
So,
But you also made very much fun of me for my flexibility 4 years ago. So that could also be part of it when going higher up. Yeah.
well, avoiding that position will not make you any more flexible. I can tell you that much. And the thing is that, remember, if it's lats, it's not pure overhead. It needs to be somewhat up and in front. And the thing that's going to make the least amount of difference, if you're in slight internal rotation here, that's totally fine. We're essentially just getting the muscle lined up here in that instance, because the lat is a slight internal rotator, right? Excuse me. So when we look at the length change, okay, whether we model it or we actually look at the research where they would do it, so they look at shear waves. So basically they use a form of ultrasound that actually looks to see how the sarcomeres are stretched, okay? We see that basically, yes, we are still going to get a decent amount of range of motion here. The other thing is, remember that the upward rotation and elevation is going to increase. I'm going to be able to actually move the sternoclavicular joint more as I go more into that upward rotation. Okay, so to the answer of all right, can you get more length there? The answer is yes. For the leverage perspective, right? The idea that the lat becomes has no leverage to do shoulder extension as we start to get up overhead, okay? That comes from modeling where there is no tissue volume assumed. That meaning that basically the lat can start to run parallel to the bone, okay? Which is not something that actually happens. So if you've ever seen an actual lean person train, you know that basically the lat maintains an off-angle pull even at the highest degrees, because it actually comes around the teres major, right? So one, the models that have the lat going to no shoulder extension moment at the top they're just not realistic models. Okay. And if you look at the research, there's really only one study that concludes that, and the other studies that we have do not. So I think a lot of people, for whatever reason, they have attached themselves to one study that was popular on social media and have forgotten every other piece of evidence on internal moment arms, right? And they also don't understand how limited this data is, right? In terms of like, okay, if we're modeling, et cetera, whatnot. Like for instance, when I do the model of the lats and I'm looking at this, I have to build a little block to simulate the volume of the teres muscle so that as the arm goes overhead, the lats don't just go parallel to the humerus. In fact, in the models, what will actually happen if you don't put that in is the lats will actually go to the other side of the arm. And there are studies that will publish data where things like that happen in these models, and they just they don't correct it. It's just what is the model is like. Literally, muscles can go through bones in these models, which is obviously not something that happens in real life. So,
Yeah.
is there for you as an N of one? Maybe a point where a certain range of motion is uncomfortable for you for whatever reason. Maybe. Okay. But that doesn't change the foundational information of like, okay, could we get to a longer muscle length going more overhead? Would that be a better place to get the bias? Yes. And then do we really care even if the glenohumeral moment arm for the lats was dropping? Well, if our goal is to train it at the other joint, it actually becomes easier to isolate the other joint if our leverage at the joint we're not trying to move becomes worse. Because then that means that the force is going to produce movement at the joint it has better leverage and less movement at the joint that it has poor leverage. So actually having extremely poor leverage in an overhead position would be favorable to isolating the depression action because it would make it easier to isolate that movement without also the elbow coming down, right? So, I mean, so just from a principle perspective, okay, in overhead position, right? Again, it's not completely overhead. It's going to be like, you should basically, if we're doing this, you should still be able to see your arm. Like for people that are, just listening to this, like I'm holding my arm up, like I was stretching my lats, but I should, like my arm should be in front of my head enough that if my head is in a neutral position, I still see my biceps. If it's back here, I'm probably too overhead for a lat plane motion, right? It doesn't mean the lats stop working up here. It just means that as I start going back over here, I'm going to start being able to utilize more pecs and stuff like that. And the motion just isn't going to be as specific to the lats as having that slightly backward pull as well, right? And that may be for you, you just need to find that right balance of those things. Okay. The other thing is that, when you're looking at these exercises, the technique of getting into those positions, as people have like poor scapular humeral rhythm, that can be part of it. So sometimes what you need to do to be able to improve your ability to work those ranges is you actually need to do the opposite motion, which would be like maybe like an overhead shrug type motion, where you're actually training the upward rotation. You're training the scapular humeral rhythm in the antagonist action, because right now maybe your body is getting uncomfortable there because it's poor at coordinating the joint position there. So you having that terrible mobility, like it might be good to like get into some of these positions and do like a stretch or some pauses there. But the thing that might also really help improve that is literally doing the opposite action, right? So that you're actually coordinating the upward rotation rather than just trying to do it eccentrically only, right?
I think you got client now. We will round it up.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you, Cass.
Okay. I had one more question. When it comes to one of your guidance, when it comes to biasing different muscle groups, do you have time? Or then you also look at how big of degree, how big of a length does the muscle go through? And that is actually also what we try to do with our like exercise variation when we compare to other people on the social media when you just do a pull down, but with the shoulder blade fixed down. That's what we try to achieve with comparing this shoulder extension with the elevation and also protraction to see if we could get even more range of motion out of the lats and perhaps that way also bias it because it becomes a bigger agonist over the shoulder or the sternoclavicular joint, but also the glenohumeral joint. What would your take be to that if you compare like our version and the more the exercise I see a lot on social media at this point where you keep the shoulder blade down and just do purely extension.
Yeah. So you're going to get more range of motion at the lats if you're incorporating movement at both the sternoclavicular and the glenohumeral joint, for sure. Greater range of motion. Okay. What essentially, if you're holding the shoulder down, you're kind of holding a depression isometric while doing shoulder extension, right? So will the lats still be working? Yes, but it'll be more of a short partial. Um, and it's hard to know what the difference in outcome is there. What you'll probably find is that just simply your performance drops significantly when you're trying to like hold the depression isometric and do that. But what tends to happen is there's an increase in sensation because they're kind of holding that constant depression. Excuse me. This is where you can get in trouble chasing the feel of an exercise because feel doesn't always necessarily correlate to stimulus or mechanical tension. Sometimes feel just means like, oh, there's a certain part of coordinating the movement or I'm holding a certain muscle length or something that is giving me a certain sensation. So I think like if you were to compare your guys' exercise to somebody that was doing shoulder depression and just doing isolated shoulder extension, that yes, your exercise would be better. Now, in terms of the protraction component, like protracting to lengthen, good. But if you're holding protraction, that could also work against you on the lats because holding protraction would mean that basically you're allowing a little bit more of the pecs and stuff. So, excuse me, you would want to allow the protraction, but then you would want to do depression and retraction with it. So you'd want to make sure that you're doing the lat action in both retraction and depression relative to the motion you're pulling in and not trying to maintain protraction. Because if you're trying to maintain protraction, that introduces different problems than holding depression, right? Potentially worse problems. So just in that instance, you could do that. I think, like I said, I'm not saying your guys' exercise is a bad exercise by any means. It's a good lat exercise. It's just that comparative to biasing the lats over the teres, it's just only going to do that a small negligible amount, right?
Makes sense.
So, but most people probably, if you're looking at physiques, people need a big teres. Like, so the question is like, do you need to take the teres out of it, for your goals? Like, that's another question, entirely, right? Is like, at what point does a client need to isolate their lats from the teres versus at what point is this like, hey, if we can grow both of these, that's great.
And the thing is, we also try, the main purpose we also did is also to get, when you get at the long position or the lengthened position, you also get a huge, like, external moment arm, and then it decrease to like close to zero, but still like on the anterior side of the delt, so still some kind of moment arm to the shoulder joint or to the glenohumeral joint. So it's also to match the resistance profile a bit better compared to when you, for example, had to do normal D handle, where we had trouble with achieving a huge external moment arm at lengthened position and a small at shorten because, yeah, when you get down to shorten, then you also run into forearm against, your biceps.
But keep in
Does that
mind,
make sense?
you're only looking at the glenohumeral joint there, and you're not accounting
Yeah.
for this, right? So that's the thing is if you're overhead, even if the glenohumeral joint had like the external moment arm was zero, you still have the external moment arm here that's loading the depression action, right?
Yeah.
So just in that instance, again, if you get to a point where the glenohumeral motion is less loaded externally, it's going to allow you to then bias more to the thing that is working on the sternoclavicular joint. So it's not bad or good. It's just, is that moving it in the direction that you wanted, right? Because if you're trying to find an exercise that's maintaining the resistance challenge at the glenohumeral joint, then you're biasing the exercise more towards the shoulder extensors, adductors, which is going to include teres and rear delts. If you're doing it the other way, right, it's going to bias more towards exercises that or muscles that are helping with the depression and retraction. The lats are going to be a part of both because it does both.
Yeah, makes sense. Is there anything you want to talk more about when it comes to the statement that Jackson made in his video? We should also say that we're probably also going to make a podcast with Jackson and a biomechanics student. around the exact same topic to see both sides, to see who has the best like arguments for the depression of the scapula. But are there anything we have missed so far when it comes to his video you want to clarify?
No, I mean, I don't think so. Mm. I think the biggest thing, was the stuff at the beginning of just confusing indirect and direct with magnitude and just applying a weight of strength or magnitude to anatomy or attachment terms, right? I think is where the biggest disconnect is. Right?
Makes perfect sense. Uh, we want to say thank you for having you on, and I also want to say I also have taken your online, what's called courses, all free: the biomechanic, the program design, and also the stress and management of that. Haven't got over to you just like Victor, but we'd love to have you on, and would also like to hear if it would be possible to send some products to you, and then you can see how it is and what you like about it, some feedback to us about how to improve it, and we would love your takes on that.
Yeah, sure. I love testing stuff as long as you're okay with me giving my fully honest opinion.